All right, welcome to week one. Actually, it should be 204Z. I need to change that. Went through a course number change a while ago. Anyway, yeah, introduction to sociology. These are weekly videos I put together to give you background information, hopefully make the content more understandable, digestible, more interesting, and kind of bring it to life that way. So, and before I get started, if you ever have any questions about the content or you want to meet and just talk about sociology or you're kind of curious, well, what do you do with a degree in sociology? Any of that stuff, stop on by. More than happy to spend time with you and talking about the field and talking about yeah, what to do with the degree in sociology. So if we were to define sociology, what is it? It's the ology is the study of. So sociology is the study of society, and it's the systematic study of society. So we're trying to develop, we have theories and concepts, we have different ways of thinking that's trying to understand more systematically the world around us. Versus like our own, we all have, like our own ideas and thoughts and beliefs and all that kind of stuff, which is great. That's who we are. But we're trying to explain something. It's like, okay, that's one person's perspective, right? It's like, okay, that's Tom's perspective, but then there's the sociological perspective. There's a framework, there's a way of thinking, there's language, there's theories, there's ideas. And this becomes important because as Khaldun, from the Middle East, and he's one that some identify as kind of like the founder of the ideas of sociology. He was as cities were developing and his involvement, thought it'd be really important to collect basically information, like census information on the population to better understand what's going on in the community, which starts to get us into that sociological kind of thought. Let's look at the patterns of behavior across a community of people. So if we just blindly follow customs and traditions, doesn't mean that the dead are alive, but the living are dead, that we're not actively using our thought process and critical thinking. And it's important that we do that. So if we look at something like the unhoused individuals who are experiencing homelessness, you get into a lot of what we call macro level, sort of big picture pieces. Poverty in the United States, economic inequality, what's gone on in terms of wages and inflation. What about affordable housing? How do we understand that? Lack of access to medical and mental health care, domestic violence. I mean, a lot of major, big piece, macro level issues, right? And then there's the micro level, more individual, small group. We're getting to like meanings and identities. I may never experience being unhoused, but I have thoughts and ideas, right? So that's part of the micro level is like, what are people's thoughts, ideas, meanings that they associate with being housed, unhoused, homelessness, even like the language change, like we've moved, there's greater recognition or use of the word unhoused to say versus homeless because some people have a dwelling, they have what their home, right? So that's kind of the where this comes from. They have their home. It may not be what I would decide to live in or choose to live in, but given the circumstances that people are in, that is their home. So if people talk about being unhoused. Anyway, so we got macro level, micro level to be able to do that. So that's kind of the general idea of sociology. We're investigating society, and that involves the micro level and the macro level. So they kind of get into the beginner's mind, which I think is an important concept. And the beginner's mind is sort of this idea that to approach things with fresh eyes, right? We've been socialized into this world. We have our own unique experiences, which we want to value that and treasure that. And then sometimes that can get us into trouble because we're so used to thinking in certain ways or have certain ideas that when we're confronted with something that may be a little bit different, maybe we react to that not with an open mind or an expert mind, but or we react to it with a closed mind and with a mind that's an expert that says, I know it already, I don't need to know anymore. That's not allowing for a richer, deeper understanding of things. So a beginner's mind is really important to have. Like I said, we know our mind's been filled with a lot of stuff through socialization, mass media, etc., our family experience, whatever those experiences are. And then that can become our worldview. And it's important to be able to allow, let's look at different worldviews, right? Doesn't mean I lose my own worldview, but I'm willing to look at things with different sets of eyes. So if you look at poverty, for example, I may have strong convictions about poverty and what causes poverty, but let's take a beginner's mind, like, and be able to explore this in a more systematic way and a way that's maybe more objective than just through what we've learned through socialization. So step back, observe, understand something before providing some judgment or before providing some interpretation, right? And this becomes a reason why I introduce this in a sociology class, because we're going to be talking about things like gender and sexuality and race and inequalities and talk about things that touch upon like values and beliefs. So if I have like this really strong view about welfare, temporary assistance to needy families, or food stamp programs, if I have really strong ideas about that, and then sociology is going to ask questions like, okay, sometimes within our particular culture, we provide a lot of stigma to or negative reaction to people who are receiving welfare benefits. And so I want to understand that. I'm going to ask questions about what's going on, like from a dollar amount in terms of federal government and the outlay of money for these programs is so small. What's this reaction really about, right? So if I have a really strong conviction about welfare, that may kind of get in the way of being able to more systematically, more objectively understand something. So part of the beginner's mind too is looking at the taken for granted world. So the world that's taken for granted is the world that we're in this culture and this space and our lived experience, and we take it for granted, right? It's like somebody moves to Central Oregon for a while, they see the mountains every day, right? And then after a while, you don't see them anymore. I mean, you still see them, but they don't take that same presence in your mind after you've been here 15, 20 years until you really try to be conscious of it, or there's a fresh snowfall, right? And because the world gets taken for granted, it gets really normalized. So we want to kind of like poke into the taken for granted world and ask questions about things. um, so Suzuki, who brought Zen Buddhism to the United States back in the 1960s, I believe. I can get this quote here: if your mind is empty, it's always ready for anything. It's open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. And that's a great way of capturing the idea. So what are the barriers to achieving a beginner's mind? I think, we get kind of like our own lived experience. We want to hold on to a certain value and belief, and just because I want to understand another value belief system doesn't mean I have to relinquish my own. It's like, okay, let's understand these different value and belief systems. I can understand, white nationalism or white supremacy without agreeing to it. I can understand where it comes from, right? I can understand some things that are going on in that space. So it could be that some of the barriers are, our own convictions, our own socializations. We're unaware that we've achieved, that we're unaware of what our values and beliefs are and um, how we're holding on to them in ways that the evidence doesn't dictate, right? The evidence may be like, let's look at that more systematically. It may be different than what you're thinking, right? So being able to see that through that lens. I'll give you a couple different examples. Flight attendants, it's like, of course, back in the day, stewardesses, and they're all female. And there were just, so imagine, okay, let's go back 1960s, commercial flights are taking off, no pun intended. That to be a flight attendant, you had to be single. You had to be at a certain age. You were let go. You could no longer work within the field. You had to have never been married. There were these arbitrary. There are these requirements and conditions for employment that we look at that today and we go, what? People couldn't work if they were married? They couldn't be a flight attendant if they're married? What's up with that? So during that, to bring this up to like during that time period, this is the taken for granted world. It's the normalized world. Some people may be asking questions about it, but it's like, okay, let's think about what's going on in that particular time period. We have the advantage of history to look back and we can do that more objectively. What's harder to do is during the moment when it's there to be able to look at things more objectively. On the bottom right corner there, you see a picture with like this architectural design, and it's to prevent people from sitting. It's you see these in all over in urban environments, park benches that got a rail or an armrest right in the middle to it's ways to prevent individuals from occupying space in these particular areas. So it's built into the architectural design. Right. So this is normal in our environment. We don't even see it anymore because it's been kind of normalized. I think another one, looking at the gender symbols of gender in the bathroom. Like, and there's, been a lot of conversation, I don't know, 10 years ago, transgender bathrooms and the cultural reaction, the reaction within culture. Just really fascinating to start thinking about where people's ideas and where our own ideas come from about going to the bathroom and ideas of privacy. It's just kind of always been interesting to me that, going to the bathroom is a physical process. We all go through that process. And so we have these ways in which we've done that within our culture, but that's not a universal, right? So let's be kind of aware of that. The top left, I love boobies campaigns. This is a way of raising awareness for breast cancer. But this is problematic. I mean, it's a in one sense, it's like, okay, it raises awareness in kind of this, in a way, right? Trying to draw people's attention to a particular social issue. I think there's a lot of value in that, but it's also the objectification of women to do that. And so it's kind of this really strange, interesting place. The organic milk, Kirkland. So you get this milk carton, right? So advertising is great stuff. This is like we've walked by, let's say, a grocery store aisle, seen this milk so many different times, just never thought about it. You can't be observant of everything in our environment. Never noticed that on this sort of thing of milk, you get there's no people, there's no farmers. They got this red barn. You got a couple chickens, these little chickens on there. It's this idealized image of a farm. And there's no way that a cow came from that farm, made that milk, right? So this is, I think, important taken for granted world is let's look at the world around us, the images that we see, the landscape around us, and ask questions about it to better understand what's going on. So the beginner's mind, the strange of the familiar, and white privilege is an example. So privilege are things that are unearned, an advantage that people have that's experienced individually, but it's also part of the larger world that we live in, right? It's embedded or integrated into our systems. So as a member of the dominant group, white, for myself, my experience of my whiteness is largely invisible. I don't see and recognize how whiteness plays a role in my own life, unless I want to more consciously be aware of that. So it's largely invisible. Uh, Without investigating and seeking to understand how race structures my reality, so the opportunities that I have available, understandings of the self, self-development, culture, society, my racial identity stays invisible. So I don't even recognize my racial identity. As a member of a dominant group, there's greater privilege to do that. So that's, I mean, if I can choose to do that, I keep it unconscious to not think about, my racial identity. But to think about that racial identity and think about whiteness, think about my own identity around race becomes really valuable, becomes a way of better understanding myself, and then also being able to better understand the experience of different groups of people, right? So if you have communities of color, people of color, individuals who don't have the same experience around race. So it becomes really valuable to do that. Now that's going to take a beginner's mind because the members of the dominant group largely, because it's invisible, it's not something that people have recognized. So rather, if somebody started to, ask me questions about my white identity, maybe X number of years ago, my reaction would have been like, "Hey, I don't have an identity around race," pushing back on it. And that's like an expert mind already, right? So a beginner's mind is let's be open about it. Let's think about it. What's the question being asked? If there's an emotional reaction that's telling me that something going on in that space, it's more about me than it is about this goal of trying to understand something. So understanding, ideas about whiteness, the ways in which I've had privilege in my life around race, doesn't erase my accomplishments. It puts them in perspective. It helps me to understand myself better and others. All right, so now let's move on to sociological imagination. So this is a concept. C. Wright Mills, a Columbia University professor, 1950s, 60s. I don't know the length of his tenure. But he wrote a book called Sociological Imagination. In the assignment, you have couple different sources you can look at. There's a chapter I included. There's the more updated version that doesn't have the kind of like the gender exclusive language. So he uses men to refer to people. This is like the common language back in the day. Look at the taken for granted world, right? If we're, that was like the way in which things were written, to use like mankind versus humankind, etc. And now we see that language through a different lens. Anyway, a little tangent there. Sociological imagination, very important. Like this is like it sets a framework of thinking about sociology. So for Mills, neither the life of the individual nor the history of society can be understood without both. And I think this is beautiful, amazing. So your life, your journey, there's no way to really understand it unless you can understand society and your place within it. And we can't understand society unless we understand the journeys of individuals. So it's going to require that we kind of like, I think one of the values and benefits of sociological imagination, it helps us to better understand society and also better understand our journey and the journey of others. There's a handout also in the weekly folder that could be helpful. So look that over if you want. I think important to recognize that Mills wrote this in the 19, I think it's 1959, coming out of World War II, mass consumption culture. There's this age of conformity going on, we called in the 1950s. And Mills like, there's a lot of social problems and issues going on that we need to pay attention to. And it's a time period of complacency. People are not as actively involved in thinking about these issues. It's probably part of it's coming after the war. People just kind of want to move forward, don't deal with the tough issues. And he's like, we need to develop a sociological imagination if we're going to create this project of democracy and have a functioning society, that we need to be aware of things like racial inequality, class inequality, and issues in the world around us. So you made a distinction also between private troubles and public issues. So private troubles, let's say I'm experiencing mental health challenges, depression or anxiety, that's a private trouble, but it's also related to a larger public issue that mental health is something that is a relationship to society that through whether it's social media, the jobs that are available to us, the economic pressures, that creates an environment that makes mental health concerns more likely as a collective. So these are public issues. This is one of the problems, or I think one of the insights that sociology offers, which I think is really useful, is that if part of the problem is the structure of society, then we need to address the structure of society to help address the issue, right? But in our individualistic culture, we focus on treating the individual. So that could be mental health. If there's a rising mental health problem, we focus on the individual versus the structure. And this is the problem, is we need to develop a greater sociological imagination collectively and recognize these are broader social issues that we need to address the macro level in. Same can be said for the unhoused and the homeless. I mean, focus on the structure, right? It could be a private trouble for those individuals, but it's a larger public issue. I think a great example is that 96% of dental hygienists are females. It's going to be interesting to see how that changes over time. But okay, there's a lot of social forces going on that's shaping that particular outcome. There's very few professions that are that concentrated in terms of gender. So what's going on? Like, right? Like, let's take a beginner's mind, think about it. Let's develop a sociological imagination and think about how did that happen? That we have that kind of difference in terms of gender, percent of women within that particular field. If you look at the United States, we have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the prisoners around the world are in the United States. I mean, it's pretty powerful, right? And that's the taken for granted world. It's a world around us. We don't even think about it. Perhaps we don't think about it. And it's being aware of like these different things. Like, okay, how do we explain that? Like, what did it look like 40 years ago? Like, this is a manifestation 1980s and on, from the war on drugs, et cetera, led to this particular outcome. But it leads to a lot of thinking and critical thinking about, criminal justice and policies, et cetera. Okay, let's talk about sociological imagination and self-determination. So it's a key idea I'd like to get across throughout the course of the term. Self-determination is the individual free will making decisions. So the individual making decisions, and then the that's the free will, and then there's the determinism, either social determinism, the environment, or biological determinism, biology. So we have this interplay between the individual, free will, and either social or biological determinism, the environment determining outcomes or biology. The reality is it's going to be a combination of both. So think about it this way. Self-determination is the individual making a decision within an environment, and different people in that environment have different choices available to them based on their class, their race, region of the country, etc. They have different choices available to them. Their networks, their family, friends, either provide support and encouragement for making certain decisions, or discouragement for others. And that's going to be different based on a person, their networks, right? So people making decisions within an environment context. That environment context is also historical, it's cultural, it's being shaped by gender, race, class, a lot of different factors. So self-determination, right? Individual, and thinking about the social, biological. You can think about like it's kind of like getting into like nature and nurture, the combination between those two things. It's the individual and society, right? But it's the complexity in which we think about that. I encourage you to go to the handout in the weekly folder, walking through self-determination. And then if you have questions, let me know. It comes up with this little fish. Is like we tell the story, like little fish, like, oh, it just like it wanted it so bad, right? And that what that says is the other fish didn't want it. They didn't want to get out and get into that other bowl. But you can start to raise all kinds of different questions. Well, what made that one fish, leave the bowl versus the other fish? What kind of environment were they? What kind of environment were they in? Who were they surrounded by? Why are we celebrating and focusing on the individual? And what does it say about the other fish that did not leave that bowl? Right. I think you're getting where I'm getting here. This sort of idea of think about social class. Those who made it at the top really must have wanted it really bad. Those who don't make it, it's a lack of effort. It's like that's a really incomplete story. It's a biased story. It's a story without any imagination. It's a story that is reinforcing inequality. It's like, okay, the individual took effort in that space to be able to do that. There's no doubt about that. But the larger story is much more complicated than that. So they use like looking at self-determinism through teeth. I think it's a good example. It's the taken for granted world. Like we have this cultural notion in terms of presentation of our mouth or our teeth, different cultural practices in terms of teeth. It's the individual making choices within an environment. That choice could be shaped by gender too. I would say, do you look at gender ideas of beauty? There may be different sense for females growing up in the United States versus males growing up in the United States. What about social class? The influence of social class on access to orthodontia, access to dental care. What about the foods we eat and nutrition? I mean, there's a lot of different things that are going to go on to that space. What about all these products, the commercialization of our teeth, the commodification of our teeth? I mean, they're getting to that kind of element as well. So yeah, it's us making choices to make our teeth wider than they were before, let's say. It's still people making choices, but they're not making that choice in isolation. They're making that choice within an environment and a context. All right, so linking information to individual lives. So understanding the self and the social world, so individual and society, add knowledge and perspective to more thoroughly and objectively examine links. So getting into information and perspective sharing so we can more objectively understand the micro level and the macro and the difference between the two. Encourage understanding larger social forces and their impact. So social forces, those things that are outside of us, but that impact us. It helps to humanize or understand ourselves and also cultivate empathy, the understanding of others. And I think it's applicable to all professions, medical service, human services, CJ, criminal justice, education, and even science, technology, engineering, and math. I mean, it's about the human journey and human experience. What to do with the social degree? A lot of different things: social work, human services, going into law, working in the public sector. There's a great area called public sociology or social policy. Public policy is another one. These are great areas. If you have questions about fields and you can let me know and we can talk about that. All right. So the core sociological theories, we got four of them. Start off with functionalism. There's a video. There's so many resources out there for these little videos, people giving little lectures. And I encourage you to watch some of them to give you a better understanding of these theories. The general idea of structural functionalism, I should say before getting started too, is that these theories they're complex. There's, like Durkheim, who came up with the idea of functionalism. He wrote that in an application to, or that theory developed over a course of different works and research that he did. If you look at the number of pages to describe functionalism, it's going to be massive. Our general idea is to get some basic core ideas of these theories. So functionalism is the idea that if there's something that exists in the structure of society, it must have some function, and that we looking for society, a stability within society. We're looking for a consensus, not necessarily a universal agreement, but like a democracy is a consensus. We have a way of voting and putting people into office. It's a way of participating. We want our elected officials to be a voice for us within our community. Of course, then we get into like there's dysfunctions in our political system, like gerrymandering. We're drawing districts that favor or help ensure that a candidate from a particular party gets into office. That's challenging to democracy. So we have dysfunctions, and the question that Durkheim or a functionalist would say is that if we have a dysfunction in society, all societies have dysfunction. If it gets too large, that dysfunction, there's a desire to provide remedies or reform to help ensure that society operates in a more stable way. A key part of functionalism is the idea of integrating people in society and regulating behavior, so social control. So integrating people, belonging, connection. Sports are an amazing way of doing that, right? Sports, the arts, belonging to a community of people, super important. Stable societies are much more stable when there's a sense of collectiveness within that, when there's a belonging and a connection. Durkheim's earliest work is on suicide and looking at something rather than an individual only explanation of looking at the larger social environment. During his time period, as individuals who were Protestants more than Catholics Protestants more likely to commit suicide than Catholics, and that's a relationship to religion. Then we get into like he also identified that people who were married were less likely to commit suicide than those who were not married. Those without kids more likely to commit suicide than those with kids. So it's about integration and belonging, an important part. So if we look at things like, inequality, economic inequality is the best predictor of a country's homicide rate. Um, and so there's something going on in the structure, like economic inequality is driving homicide rate. There's a dysfunction in the system. And the question is going to become one, how much of that dysfunction can a society stand? And then at what point do we make a change to that inequality? Conflict theory is going to be looking at this as Marxism, Karl Marx, a theorist, a political economist, looking at trying to understand economic system. I think Marx gets a kind of a wrong rap or a bad name in a lot of ways because people don't understand what his theory and where, he was trying to provide an analysis. He's looking at economic systems over a long period of time. He was definitely about trying to organize workers to be a voice against the capitalist, that he saw that capitalism is fostering a system of inequality and that, to make it more equitable, that the workers needed to unite and to raise their voice. So it is like Marxism addresses power, inequality, does not believe that the system is set up in ways that are beneficial to everyone, that it's benefiting some people, the elite, over the masses. And the way to change that is through radical restructuring of a system. I think about healthcare. We got a healthcare delivery system. private insurance and public insurance for sure as well. I get really, from a Marxist perspective, thinking about if there's going to be a healthcare reform, this would be much more of a functionalist idea, right? To reform, make some small, gradual changes. Those reforms are going to benefit probably the medical establishment, probably more. Probably that's going to be an important part, right? Not that people are that a disservice to people is trying to be done, but if we have the pharmaceutical companies and medical establishments sitting at the table drawing up policy, federal policy, the chances are those policies that are going to be developed are going to be benefiting their own pockets. This would be more of a conflict theory kind of perspective. Symbolic interactionism is looking at the symbolic world, meaning, language, so looking at, like I'm trying to think of an example, looking at the material culture or symbols in our environment. We see Patagonia. What does that mean? What does that represent? We all have individual interpretations of that, but we also have cultural interpretations of that as well. Symbolic interactionism gets us to address our identities, how we think about ourselves and how we see others. So it's more of a micro level kind of groups individual theory. And then we get into Weber, Max Weber, German theorist who a couple different, he's kind of always an interesting one to kind of to talk about because he kind of goes into a couple different areas. One of them is this idea of Verstehen, where it's empathy, trying to understand the experience of other people, right? Suspend our own judgments and values and just imagine understanding a person's view and experience, where they come from, a rich person, a poor person in the working class, understand their life and experience, right? That idea. And then Weber is probably more well known for his theory and work on bureaucracy, understanding bureaucracy, rationality. We think about AI, these AI generators, the world of social media and data today. Weber would have a field day because what he'd see is like a lot of this stuff, there's some value in all this data, there's benefit, but there's also, it's an iron cage that we just focus on so much on the rationality that we're losing our own humanity in that process. So he's a little bit more, sees the pluses and minuses there. We won't go through all the theories, but I just encourage you to think about the different theories. There's a research process. Like if you start off with a question and you kind of develop a way of thinking about it, raise a question, do an experiment. There's this process, right? And it's not like it goes through stage by stage. Sometimes multiple things are going on at the same time. But there are all these different research methods. I'm not going to go through them now, but they provide a lot of different value, different kinds of value. We have quantitative, which is more focused on numbers. So looking at surveys, you can collect data. You're looking at a quantitative analysis oftentimes. Then you get the qualitative, like thick descriptions, spending time in a particular group of people, walking away with observations. That's much more rich in terms of qualitative design. We can look at different studies, different research. I won't walk through all of these, but this one is a blend between quantitative and qualitative, talking about people's journeys and experiences coming north from Central America, but also incorporating a lot of data in there as well. Billionaire Wilderness is about Jackson County, Wyoming. And Pharrell, who's a sociologist, can't remember what university, but him spending time in that particular community. It's a little ethnographic work. So he's in the community, interacting with people who have helicopter pads in their backyard. And then he kind of does provide some data as well. And then he's just like, and he does this really cool thing called a social network analysis. So definitely quantitative, where he's looking at connections between people within the community. And he gives you an insight into this idea of the billionaire wilderness. Super fascinating. This is a lot of history here. Same here. This one, I think symbolic interactionism is so rich with that, about how cultures think about sexuality over the course of time. Super fun. She's really interesting. There's podcasts with her talking about this work. That might be something you might be interested in. So which research method would you use? If you're looking at poverty in rural America, white supremacy, subcultures, psilocybin use, sexual assault in prisons. I mean, go back to all these different research methods, with the exception of experimental design. These probably could all be used to understand these different social issues. And the reason why we want research, so we can have more data. And the more data we have, we can have more objective ways of trying to understand something. All right, so that's it for today. SOC204z. Welcome to class. If you have any questions, let me know. And I encourage you as you go through the assignment, or you printed out the handout, the assignment, and you had it next to you as you're watching the lecture video. I think that can be really helpful because you can take notes that way that are directed specifically to the questions. Yeah, if you have any questions about anything, let me know. Have a great day. Have a great week.